penetration testing, simulated threat type things, done some book stuff, and also contribute to open source software tools like Metasploit, browser exploitation framework, and that sort of stuff. And so today what I wanted to do was start off by doing an overview of pen testing and discussing some of the OWASP top 10, and then actually show you guys how some of these actually play out by doing hacking, using some tools that you guys can actually use on your own systems, providing you have permission, and then we're going to do some QA. Sitting in a dark room just watching somebody ramble for 45 minutes, an hour, isn't always a lot of fun. So if you guys have questions, I strongly encourage you to ask them. I've built in a bunch of time at the end for questions. So if you have questions as stuff comes up, please feel free to ask and interact, because I'll almost guarantee that if you have a question or a comment or strongly disagree with me, then somebody else will as well. So that sort of stuff is good for sparking conversation. So what is penetration testing? And it's kind of interesting because there's no actual formal term for exactly what penetration testing is. Companies sort of use it to mean lots of different things, which creates some confusion. So how many people here get regular pen tests at their location? How many people here hit raising hands? Okay. So for penetration testing, most of the common things that are involved are taking advantage of exploits and then showing what the logical outcome is. So for instance, say you have a vulnerability on a web server. Okay, so you have a vulnerability on the web server. What's the next question? So what? Why does it matter that I have a vulnerability? Well, if you have a vulnerability, then somebody can take advantage of it and get access to your system. Well, don't really keep any sensitive information there, so what's the big deal? Well, they can use that to actually pivot to your database server, which does have sensitive information in it, but they don't have access to that database, so what's the big deal? Once they get access to that system, they can get access as the OWASP database to the database server itself. And so with pen testing, what we try to do is we answer the so what. And so at the end of a pen testing exercise, you should have an idea of what security constraints are working well, which ones aren't working well, and also sort of what the outcome would be if any of the things that we listed are taken advantage of. And the big one is you'll have attack chains. Attack chains are the series of events that lead one to the next. And why do attack chains matter? Attack chains matter because if you were investing money, you want to put your money first and deal with the big things that have the greatest impact on that attack chain. So for instance, somebody can move widely through your network. Maybe the first place you want to spend money is making it so it's harder to move around on your network. Those sort of things. So have you guys heard terms like vulnerability assessment or validated vuln scan, those sort of things? There's actually companies that are selling those as pen tests. And here's where the big differences lie for that. For vulnerability assessments, what those are is somebody comes in your organization, they run a vulnerability scanner, they beat out some of the most common false positives, and they give you a report on what they found. How many people here have vulnerability scanning processes already within their organization? Okay, so maybe a couple at least. So what these guys are doing is not actually adding a lot of significant value. They're running maybe a different vulnerability scanner and giving you the results from that, but it doesn't really answer any of the so what's, right? So others are doing validated vulnerability assessments. Sorting through vulnerability assessment reports takes a while. You look kind of silly when you go to people, or people come to you and say, this is a vulnerability, and you go, it's like, I patched that. This is a false positive. You're wasting my time, right? So that's a problem from a security standpoint, and nobody wants to have their time wasted. So the validated vulnerability assessment, the goal for those is to sort of weed those out, but they still don't fundamentally answer any of the so what's. And then the more fun one is threat simulation. More and more people are asking for threat simulations for penetration tests. And so penetration tests really take advantage of the attack chains, but because everybody knows that the pen testers are there, it's not really a secret, A lot of the time people are specifically watching where they're coming from, what they're doing to see what they see, but it doesn't really tell you what the impact would be of an actual attacker. For our forensics investigations, one of the most interesting things is the amount of time people have been breached by the time we get called. We do a fair number of credit card assessments where people have gotten compromised and credit cards have been stolen. So a lot of the time these guys have been compromised for 6 months to, in some cases, 3 or 4 years before anything actually happens. So for threat simulation, we actually pretend like we're an attacker, see whether or not you can actually see what we're doing, what we're able to get access to. How long does it take you to detect it? To know if somebody does actually attack you, what is the time to your response? There's been a number of times when I've been on-site pen testing, and day one I've done a bunch of stuff. And then when we're doing the exit debriefing on the last day, they get a phone call and says, we're your managed security provider, we detected an incident. And they're like, okay. And it turns out it was Monday, and it was when I gained access to their domain controller. And so I've now had pervasive access to their network for 5 days before they got a phone call about it. So how long does it take you to respond is one of the big things that most organizations need to be able to know how long it's going to take them to respond and recover from an incident. So obviously people get pen tests for lots of things. Compliance and governance is a big one. Security, whether it's making your organization more secure, testing whether or not your incident response works, those sort of things. And then also to prove business cases. It's hard to get money. We write reports. One of the things they have in them is strategic initiatives that should be looked at. And so a lot of the times these closely align with initiatives that are already there that may have issues getting funding. And so one of the things that we do is we actually talk about what initiatives are underway and make sure that for those sort of things we can help advance those. So before we move on to the OWASP Top 10, any questions or comments about that? Cool. So OWASP. OWASP is a project that is designed to help people understand web vulnerabilities. And so they release a top 10 list every year. The OWASP organization is 501(c). They do a lot of different things for the community, including they have lots of chapters. So if you're interested in web security, most of the big cities have OWASP chapters where you can go to and actually have meetings and talk about stuff. They're also a good place if you kind of have a general security question about infrastructure, that sort of stuff, and you just want to chat with some people about it. That's a good place to go to. And so the top 10 list is the list of the 10 most common web vulnerabilities that they have discovered. And really it's not just web. This is sort of true for applications as a whole. We talk about web applications and fat applications. Fat applications being things that are compiled that have GUIs and that sort of thing. And these actually have a fair amount of overlap. So I was going to go through each one of these to start off with, and then we're actually going to hack a box and look to see how to actually scan for these and what they look like for the scan reports, as well as how to manually validate them. And the reason that that's important to know how to do is if you're deploying a piece of software, people are going to be harassing you on the internet. So basically you want to know what the bad guys are going to see before they see it. And so if you have a critical application, strongly recommend getting somebody who's professional to look at it. But if you're doing some testing, something like that, this is a good sort of first shot. So for the first one, injection. It's basically the ability to put anything into a web page and make something weird happen. There's a bunch of different kinds. There's SQL injection. How many people have heard of SQL injection? Okay, wow, people are waking up. That's exciting. SQL injection is obviously being able to put SQL commands into a website and having them execute on the back end, and then usually really bad things happen. So cross-site scripting is technically HTML injection. It gives you the ability to inject code into an HTML page, which is technically code, and cause different actions to happen on the web page than the person who wrote the web page intended. And the other is command injection, which we don't see as much, but when we do, it's usually really, really bad. Command injection is when somebody takes the input from a web page and then puts it into an operating system command and then hopes that nothing bad happens. And usually bad things will happen. And this usually leads to being able to run commands on servers, compromise boxes, and that sort of things. Broken authentication. Broken authentication is a huge problem, especially for people who are trying to implement their own authentication. Weak password schemes are kind of huge. And we see this everywhere from banks to small mom and pop organizations. Anymore, if you're seeing boxes that tell you that your password can't contain special characters, you should just run. That's not a website that you should trust. And if it's your bank, you should fire off an email and ask what the heck they're doing. Because basically, at this point, none of the things that you're typing in a password box should ever be making it to any back-end systems. And so it should all be treated as a hash, that sort of stuff. And so you really shouldn't ever have to deal with not doing special characters. Non-SSL logins are still a problem with a lot of places. Problems with those, obviously, somebody can sniff the traffic and actually get access to resources. Broken session handling is one that's kind of hard to explain. One of the big things that phishing groups do is if you have broken session management, it means I can get a session. And you guys ever seen like a session token in your URL? So if I start a session and then send that URL out to everybody, somebody clicks on it and logs in, then they're going to have my session, I'm going to have my session, they're logged in, I'm logged in as them. So basically, the broken session stuff is sort of a big deal. And so the fix for that is anytime somebody logs in, you invalidate the old session to make sure that they have a new session to work with. And if somebody's sending out malicious links, then their session is invalidated and nobody else can get with it. And then basically anything else that allows shortcuts to gaining access. This is everything from setting a cookie that says ID equals 1, which still happens too much. That sort of thing to be able to trick the authentication scheme into believing that you're authenticated. WordPress, which you guys may be familiar with, common blog platform, for a long time had a easily crackable password as the cookie value. So any pages that had cross-site scripting on them, which we're going to be talking about next, you can actually get the cookie value and then turn it back into the admin's password. And so that was a big deal for a while. Cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting is kind of funny because a lot of people don't really understand what the impact is of it, except for that it causes your pen test report to come back and give you a rating of C. And once you fix them all, you maybe can get up to a B. And so it's technically HTML injection and allows attackers to control web pages. So here's the big one for this. Why do you care? So an attacker can make a pop-up box that says alert XSS into your web browser. So that's, whatever, right? So the big deal is that we can do lots of things, including controlling application flow. One of the projects that I work on is the browser exploitation framework. Browser exploitation framework actually sets up a beacon, kind of like what a lot of malware does. And funny enough, I don't know if any of you guys have link tracking on your website. It works very similar to that, where we can actually follow mouse moves around. When people type in passwords in sites, we can actually get the password without them actually ever hitting enter. So if you send somebody to a phishing site, they start typing their password and they look at it and they're like, actually this site's, no, we're not going to do this. We've actually already got the password as soon as they type it in. So being able to do lots of different things inside the browser, including sending malicious exploits, replacing pages with malicious content, all those sort of things. So while most pen testers will show it to you as an alert XSS, it really goes much deeper than that and can have some fairly sophisticated things. Other things that bad guys have done with it recently is you can actually detect if things like 1Password or KeePass are attached to a browser. And so if so, you can actually pop up a fake KeePass or 1Password pop-up box and see if they type it in. And then if you're able to get access to their system, you at that point have their password for their password safe. So insecure direct object reference, there's nothing funny about this, so I can find a picture. Basically, it's when somebody can go directly to something that they shouldn't be able to and get data. And you guys hear about the thing with AT&T where all of the iPhone data got leaked? because somebody was basically mining AT&T's website for iPad IDs, and so basically it was able to pull cell phone data, user data, other sorts of personal information from AT&T about the iPad users. So what the person did to do this was they looked at a web page and it was making a callback to a backend website. They said, well, okay, what data does this return? And they went directly to the URL, which was only supposed to be called through a script. And then started incrementing the numbers one at a time, and it was just different people's data. And so that's an example of insecure direct object reference, where when I go directly to something, it shouldn't give me any additional privileges or any additional information than I would have had through the other sort of consoles. So, security misconfigurations. That's pretty much the vaguest finding ever, I think. It can be basically anything at all. Most common things that we see are stuff like leaving default passwords, those sort of things in applications, not actually allowing sites to be authenticated properly, showing errors, those sort of things that can give away information. Sensitive data exposure. This one is kind of interesting because it's obviously exposure of sensitive data, but it's in a lot of different ways. I think Kevin Mendig talked yesterday a little bit about man in the middle. And so man in the middle is one of the ways that sensitive data is frequently exposed. By watching traffic on the wire, we can see things like credit card numbers, bank, ATM transactions, those sort of things a lot of the time. So making sure that all of that's encrypted in transit or otherwise protected is really important. Another one's too much data is shown back to a user, which this one's sort of weird because you're just showing the user back their own information. But most sites, for instance, when it shows you your credit card number, they shouldn't actually ever give you back your entire credit card number. And they should almost never give you back your CVV, because that's information that you should have. They don't need to tell you again, and it should just be handled. And so the other one is input boxes not obfuscated. So if you're typing in your password, somebody behind you can see it, those sort of things. Also, one of the other things with the cross-site scripting is if you have any autocompletes, if that information isn't masked, we can directly query those form elements in order to get passwords off of a web page. So if you have autofill on a page that is vulnerable to cross-site scripting, then we can actually get all of that data. And so here's a good example of sensitive data exposure. You guys may remember this, and may remember that. So this got broadcast out to everybody during the Super Bowl, and we now know their super secret secure password, along with a couple million other people. So missing function level access control. Wow, that one is kind of weird even to say. And basically what it means is that if you don't have permissions to do something on a web page, it shouldn't tell you that that thing exists. By giving you information about how somebody accesses it or that it exists at all, you can maybe trick somebody who is a higher privilege level into doing things with that URL in order to get what you want accomplished. So for instance, adding a user, that sort of stuff. And this is frequently used with cross-site scripting and CSRF, which we'll talk about in just a second, to cause additional damage. And this is, like I said, anything from adding users, executing commands, all that sort of stuff. And CSRF is another interesting one because the number of attackers that can actually explain what it works and how to protect you against it, it seems to be getting smaller and smaller. This is, I think, one of the more common questions that I've heard on job interviews is, how does this work? Because it sort of separates the people who actually understand it from the ones that don't pretty easily. Basically, for a long time, people would give you the ability to interact with URLs directly. So after you logged in, if you copied and pasted an old link or went to a bookmark, you could get back to the exact same place that you were from that bookmark. The problem is they were using it to do things like send money. So, okay, so if I send it directly to this page after I log in, then I can go ahead and transfer $500 over to Maria. The problem is if you're logged in, I can send you a link that will then transfer $500 to me just by clicking on it. So that's cross-site request forgery, where I can give you a link, you can click on it, it will perform an action that that you didn't go through business logic to perform. And so with CSRF, the way to protect it is there's a little token, as with every form. If the token isn't sit along with the form, then it's denied. And so this makes it so that if I load a site, my token will only work within my session. Somebody else loads a site and only work within their session. And so I can't give them a link that would work directly for them. And that's also a pretty awesome picture of a kid surfing on a bed. But, so vulnerable software, we don't really need to explain this one, I think, but there's a funny picture. I also like the one where somebody zip tied the chain together with the padlock. I'm sure you guys have seen that one too. Unvalidated forwards, and this one's kind of interesting. It's frequently seen as a no big deal, but it's frequently used in phishing. And you guys ever seen the redirects where somebody says, hey, this page is moved, we're redirecting you to this other site. You look at the URL, it has that other site. If you can just put random stuff there and it'll send you wherever you want, that's a problem, because if I send somebody a link saying that I'm you and that you should super trust my forward because it's going to, or my link because it's going to my site, then you'll go, okay, that looks safe, I'll click on that. And then suddenly you're sent somewhere else. So it really aids in the effectiveness of phishing campaigns. And so this is everything from, I don't know if you guys can see that, but I was just doing some basic Googling. And so for the basic Googling, this is even common in university settings and places where people are a little bit more active. And so here to give people a chance for any questions before I start doing some demos. Anybody have questions about any of this? Yep.
We've been hit a couple of times on our website where Google search results come up and say your site may have been hacked. And it says possibly hacked. So we go in and look at it and there's no code, there's no response, there's no invalid data on the page whatsoever. But if I do a fetch as Google, I see extraneous code that's in there pointing to Viagra and whatever.com. How is that can you describe what that is? And we found out it was like a Facebook link or, a script that we had linking to outside web pages on our page.
So what people are doing is looking at user agents. And this is actually increasingly common with malware, which is trying to make it harder for people who are dealing with malware on a regular basis to reverse it. And basically they're looking at your user agent and trying to determine whether or not you're a real user or whether or not you're Google. And they're using it to increase their Google ranking by providing that content. When Google sees it, Google says, oh, these guys are, UNC or whoever, these are pretty trustworthy guys, we're going to up this page rank. And so by hiding that code in pages that are only visible to certain user agents, it allows those pages to be elevated, but it can stay there for a long time because nobody notices any difference. This is pretty common, especially with blog platforms and stuff like that, where people can add in a piece of JavaScript that will change the outcome of the page depending on who's looking at it, and even in a lot of cases from where. So it can be anything from, if you're looking at it from inside the United States, you may see one thing and may see something else from somewhere else. The other option is for load balance services. A lot of the times hackers don't hack all of the things that are load balanced, they'll only get one site. So Google may have hit that one site and then it may be gone tomorrow and it may be back next week, that sort of thing. And so that's another common problem when people call and say, hey, your website's acting weird, and you go to it, it's like, everything looks good to me. You're actually looking at a different web server, and so you kind of have to go to each one in the cluster to look at. But those are two of the most common ones.
But how they did that, what is that technical term for that type of injection?
So it's actually just basically JavaScript code. Anything that you put on the page will run JavaScript, Java, anything that's interacting with the browser can do this. And so ads already do it based off your cookies, based off of where you're coming from, that sort of stuff, for targeted stuff. And so this is usually more integrated into a website than just a banner ad, because banner ads are so changed so frequently that it's not really effective. It's easier to take advantage of a piece of JavaScript that's linked by a lot of different people in order to do this. And so it's basically just replacing content in JavaScript. So it's not technically injection, it's more website defacement. is also one that's hard to track down, like I said. So it's Google is actually a great one to do this for. One of the things that I've done for any of my sites that I'm particularly worried about is I set up Google alerts for that specific scenario to let me know if anybody's tampered with pages that has been more covert. Other questions? That was a good one. Okay. So, I'm going to do some quick hacking then. How many of you guys are familiar with Kali Linux? So Kali is a pen testing distribution. It is has most of the tools that you need to do basic pen testing in it. Things for mapping and identification like CanMap, all the way to tools to actually do website and browser hacking. So it's a nice place that has all of the core stuff that is a good guy you might want to use. And one of the things I didn't talk about earlier is a lot of people like talk about ethical hacking, and I try to stay away from the term because ethics are subjective, and so our ethics may be different, and I may think you are unethical, and you may think you're ethical, or vice versa, as well as, it turns out in weird situations, people's ethics change. So, really, we tend to refer more to black hats as criminals, and the rest of them as security people for the most part, until they threaten to hack an airplane and end up being investigated by the FBI. Just saying. So anyway, this is a fake website because I don't want to go to jail, and this is basically what a lot of the exploit sites look like. You can click around, it's got little links. Zoom in real quick. But so basically as you click around, you see lots of different stuff. So if I actually wanted to test this to see where vulnerabilities might lie, one of the tools that I frequently use is a tool called Zap. Zap is another one of OWASP's tools. It's the Z attack proxy. And one of the nice things it has with it is like a magic just do stuff bar, which if you are just getting started and are trying to learn more about this, the do stuff bar is pretty good. The do stuff bar can actually impact stuff, so I suggest that before you just start running this willy-nilly against stuff, you talk to the committee and make sure that you're actually monitoring it, and that if problems show up, you know what's going to happen, and that you have permission. And even if you have verbal permission, I never work off verbal permission. Always make sure you have email before you run any of these against the production system, because memory is sort of fuzzy once you end up in a postmortem. So we're going to go ahead and click the magical attack button, and then bars start scrolling, which means stuff is happening. What's going on right now is it starts out by mapping out the website. We can see what's been mapped out just by clicking down through here. We can see all the different pages. We can also see what arguments are passed to the pages. So we can see that the ID parameter can be passed here. And anything that has a little flag with it means that it has a finding. So when we're looking through the flags, we can see what stuff is interesting and we may want to dig more into. So let's look at what a couple of the flags are right now, and we'll see if they map a lot to the OWASP top 10. So anti-CSRF tokens. Remember, CSRF is the thing that allows you to submit data as, or trick somebody into submitting data that they didn't intend to by having them submit a form by clicking a link. Cross-site scripting, and so for each one of these we can sort of dig in, and it'll show you the URL that's vulnerable, and remember I said alert XSS, this one's using alert 1 to be different. And it will also tell you, for instance, what it is, so if you need to explain it to somebody, and it will also talk about solutions and references. So this is the same sort of things that you might get from a vulnerability scanner pen test. The Zap proxy is technically a vulnerability scanner. There's other commercial ones that are a little bit more effective, but for free, kind of hard to beat. And so basically as the active scan is going through, we can watch this happening, the alerts will populate, and we can look at those. We have other types of injections. Sometimes there's false positives. So LDAP injection is frequently confused with SQL injection by scanners, because technically LDAP is a backend database, so you can influence stuff by modifying those queries, as well as changing stuff by modifying SQL queries. So a lot of times these show up as the same. For SQL injection, it does some basic tests to figure out whether or not a page is vulnerable, and it will show you the ID for what it used, and it'll also show you how to test it. And so you can actually copy and paste those together and figure that out. So after, in just a second, I'm going to show you guys how to do some of this manually, as well as how to do some of this with tools. And then other one, directory browsing. So directory browsing is when you go to a directory and it shows you all the stuff in it. And what type of vulnerability is that for the OWASP Top 10? Sensitive data disclosure, because you never know what's in those directories. It could be giving away information, it could be sensitive. A lot of the times I'll find things like the original versions of files and directories that have directory indexing that includes full source code because they named it .back instead of .php. Stuff like that, which frequently will give passwords, other sort of internal data that you can use against somebody. Private IP disclosure, how about that one? Sensitive data disclosure, again, if I can know what your internal IP structure looks like without ever having to touch it, then that's beneficial for me as an attacker, because it makes my work a lot easier if I want to use one system to attack another system inside. One of the other things that you can do with cross-site scripting is if you have somebody's browser booked, you can use that to scan the person's internal network where they are. And so I can use that information along with getting somebody to click on a phishing link to actually map out an entire internal organization based off some of the information given away by private IP disclosure. So web browser cross-site scripting not enabled, which is a server flag, so that's a server security misconfiguration. And then these two right here are also security misconfigurations. These are things that should be included by default. So let's look at a couple of these. So one of the things that it found was cross-site scripting. So let's go to articles and tutorials, and the page it found it on was here. And you can see that somebody actually left debugging on for this. So if you actually cause an error by just typing in stuff, then this says, okay, so there's an error, and it prints it back out to the screen. So what happens if I change this to actually be HTML code? So we'll start it off with a script tag, if I can learn to type. And then we'll do that alert XSS. Let's try this one more time. So what this will do is it should add a script element into the web page. It pops up a box that says XSS. Okay, sure enough. So again, this in itself, who cares? The other things that we can do with this is just indicating that we can actually control the execution of the web page, and we can do it from the URL, which is even more dangerous. So we can send this link to somebody and have much more advanced stuff done to them. So we see this right here. This is also sensitive information disclosure. We can use this to map out information about the database. And up here, we can put in other things into the database. So we can try putting in just a single tick, and we can see what shows up here. And so we can add in things like or 1 equals 1, and add a comment statement at the end, and see what error message it gives back. Or when we just do a space, we see that the query is successful. So when you can put things in there and get failed, and then put things in there and get successes just by controlling some of the syntax, that's a good indication that you actually have control. And so for this one, for instance, SQL injection is a big one. So I'm going to dig a little bit more into that one. So for this, one of the things we may want to do is actually look at whether or not we can get data out of it. To do that, I'm going to go back and get a valid page. And use the tool called SQL map. So in this directory, there's a SQLmap.py. We can just do Python SQLmap.py and specify our URL. And it will go through and try to determine whether or not this is really vulnerable. And so as it goes through, it asks you questions like, it looks like the ID parameter might be vulnerable to MySQL attacks. So we can tell it, yeah, just go ahead and work on that. And tell it to do all of the different types of tests for MySQL. When it goes through, it will try to figure out what the database looks like on the back end and what the query looks like. So what it's doing right now on the back end is super noisy. It's going through and asking lots of different types of questions in order to see what the website comes back with. Everything from when I make this request with this command in it, does it take longer than normal, to when I make this request, does it come back with data as opposed to having one extra variable and not coming back with any data, and I have my data echoed back, those sort of things to figure out how that works. And error messages is another one. Part of the reason we turn off error messages and make error messages as the least verbose possible is because we want to make sure that none of the actual things that are happening on the back end are directly exposed to users, because that can be used to help determine this one as well. So it's figured out that it's vulnerable. We can go ahead and tell it it'll stop. So from here, all of this is the SQL information about how it's put together. So you can tell exactly what payload it used to figure out it was for sure vulnerable. We know that it can be done with union statements. Union statements allow you to join two queries together, which is powerful because I can make a request that I know is valid and then just incorporate large amounts of data from other places in order to get the data in. It's also time-based blind injectable, which usually will end up having some impact on a website. So if that's going on, you can frequently see it. And it's because what's actually happening on the back end is it's causing the database to run some time-intensive queries. It will cause connections to, instead of coming back right away, take 5, 6, 10 seconds, depending on how bad the attacker's connection speed is. And so suddenly you'll start seeing these requests piling up in the database. A lot of the times your database load will shoot up because it's doing all of this intentionally time-intensive stuff. So once we sort of have some of this basic stuff, we can do things like list off the databases. So we know there's two databases here, the exploit information statement. And so let's look and see what tables are in the exploit database. And so this is the list of all the tables. So we're basically able to do queries against the database that will keep giving us more information about it. So who has a guess for where we might keep credit card data? Okay, so let's check out billing. And so now the credit card numbers come out. And so we were able to that quickly dump, that was almost I think that was 500 rows right there in just a second. So usually to dump a couple thousand to a million, maybe take about a minute at the most. And so just walking through this makes it super easy. And you don't have to write these down, they're all fake. So before we move on to anything else, anybody have questions about that? Okay. Does anybody want to know anything more about any of the other vulnerabilities that we saw at Vulnerability Scan? We sort of talked about them briefly. Okay.
Do you have to know the query that's being injected with that Python script to get that data?
So you can look at logs and it will show you what they all are. It is, especially when it's in the get line, it's also very visible from the Apache logs. But remember when it showed us that query block after it said yes, it's vulnerable? That's the core information it's using. And then it's fiddling with little pieces of variables there once it's got that in order to get the actual data out. So you can search for that. It's different for every vulnerability. It usually uses a combination of concatenation techniques in order to figure out where the data is it wants, as well as union queries to figure it out. And so it's going to be a little bit different for everyone, but you can test it with that to figure out what it's going to be. And if you're looking for it in logs, you should almost never see select and concat in the same query as a regular like HTML request. So that's a good one to sort of learn on. Any more questions about these before we move on to general questions? So we've got, I think, 15 more minutes. So I'll just go ahead and here's some potential topics. Encourage people to ask questions. It doesn't have to be about this stuff. Like I said, I do pen testing, incident response, lots of general security stuff as well. So if you guys have any questions about any of that, feel free to ask. Anybody? Any of those topics? You just want to go to lunch? All right, so I'll hang out up here for a while. If people want to come and chat, please do. And thanks for